Hey guys, tonight we are going to sit with a case that is really two stories tangled together. The story of a beloved young teacher who vanished from a small Georgia town, and the story of what a small town does to itself when one of its own disappears and no answer comes for 11 long years. Her name was Tara Grinstead, and she was 30 years old, a cherished high school teacher and a former pageant competitor, the kind of person a small town is proud to call its own. In October of 2005, she vanished from her home in Ocilla, Georgia, and for more than a decade, the town churned with rumor and suspicion while the truth stayed hidden. This is a story about a missing woman, and it is also a story about the terrible power of a rumor. Before we settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you find real value in what we do here. There is no pressure and no guilt. Thank you, truly, for the case suggestions that keep finding their way to us. We are also now on Spotify, so the link is in the description if you would rather listen there while you drift off tonight. Now dim the lights and get comfortable. This is a long one, and Tara's story deserves to be told slowly and carefully, and with an unusual degree of legal precision, because this case has been through the courts, and the outcomes are more complicated and more important to get exactly right than almost any case we tell. We are going to be very careful about who was charged with what, who was convicted, and who was acquitted, because the truth of the legal record matters, and because real people's names and reputations depend on our getting it right. We will keep Tara herself, the beloved teacher at the center, in view throughout, and we will treat the 11 years of small-town rumor not as gossip to repeat, but as a cautionary tale about the harm that suspicion can do. Have you ever wondered what happens to a small town when one of its own vanishes and no answer comes, not for a year, not for 5 years, but for more than a decade? Ocilla, Georgia, lived that, and Tara Grinstead's case is as much about what that not knowing did to a community as it is about the disappearance itself. In a small town, everyone knows everyone, and when a beloved teacher vanishes, everyone becomes, in the minds of their neighbors, a possible answer. For 11 years, the rumor mill of a small Georgia town turned and turned, casting suspicion on one person after another, most of them entirely innocent, in the desperate human search for someone to blame. That rumor mill is half the story, and we are going to tell it honestly and carefully and with real concern for the innocent people it harmed. But first, we have to meet Tara. Tara Grinstead was born in the autumn of 1974, and by 2005, she was 30 years old, and by every account, a genuinely beloved figure in her community. She was a history teacher at Irwin County High School in Ocilla, where she had taught since 1998, a dedicated educator who had earned a master's degree and who poured herself into her students. She was also a former beauty pageant competitor, having competed and won titles in the pageant world, and she continued to be involved in that world, mentoring and coaching young women who competed in pageants themselves. She was poised, accomplished, warm, and deeply woven into the life of her small town, the kind of teacher that students remember for the rest of their lives, and the kind of neighbor that a small community treasures. It is worth understanding just how beloved and how visible Tara was in Ocilla, because it shapes everything about how her disappearance landed. In a small town, a high school teacher is not an anonymous figure. She is a known and public person, someone who has taught the children of half the town, someone whose face is familiar whose life is, to some degree, everyone's business. Tara, with her teaching and her pageant involvement, was more visible than most, a local figure of real standing and affection. When she vanished, it was not the disappearance of a stranger. It was the disappearance of one of the town's own cherished people, and the whole community felt it, personally and immediately, in a way that only a small town can. Picture the shape of Tara's life in the autumn of 2005. She was a working teacher in the middle of the school year, busy with her students and her classes. She was involved in the pageant world she loved, mentoring young women. She had a home of her own in Ocilla, a life woven into the fabric of the town. She was, by every account, a responsible, engaged, well-loved young woman, active and connected and known, with no reason anyone could see to simply vanish. That ordinariness, that visible, rooted, respectable life is part of what made her disappearance so shocking and so hard to comprehend. Tara was not a drifter or a stranger. She was a pillar of her small community, and pillars of small communities are not supposed to simply disappear. Let's stay a little longer with who Tara was, because she deserves to be seen as a whole person, and not merely as the center of a famous case. As a teacher, Tara was, by the accounts of her students and colleagues, dedicated and caring, the kind of educator who invested in her students beyond the classroom, who took the time to know them and to encourage them. Teaching history, she opened young minds to the world, and she did it in a small town where a good teacher can shape an entire generation. She had earned a master's degree, a mark of her seriousness about her profession. Year after year, she stood in front of her classes at Irwin County High School, teaching the children of Ocilla, becoming part of the fabric of hundreds of young lives. That is a form of quiet importance that a small town understands, the teacher who shapes its children, and Tara was exactly that. Her involvement in the pageant world added another dimension to her life and her standing. Having competed herself, Tara continued to mentor and coach young women who competed in pageants, helping them prepare, guiding them through a world she knew well. In a place like Ocilla, the pageant world is not a frivolous thing, but a genuine part of the community's social life, and Tara's role in it made her a mentor and a figure of aspiration for young women in the area. She was, in this way too, a person who invested in others, who gave her time and her care to the young people around her, whether in her classroom or in the pageant world. She was, in short, a giver, a woman who poured herself into her community and its young people. And that is part of why her loss cut so deep. It is worth holding on to this image of Tara, the dedicated teacher and generous mentor, because it is the truest picture of who she was, and because the case that swallowed her name can so easily obscure it. Before she was a mystery, before she was a podcast subject, before she was the center of arrests and trials, Tara Grinstead was a beloved teacher who shaped young lives, a warm and accomplished woman who gave herself to her community. That is who was lost when she vanished, not a case, but a person, a genuinely good and valued member of a small town. And it is that person, the real Tara, whom we try to keep at the center tonight, beneath all the legal complexity that her disappearance eventually produced. Have you ever wondered how the loss of a single beloved teacher can wound an entire community? How the disappearance of one person who gave so much can leave a hole that a whole town feels? In Ocilla, Tara's loss was exactly that kind of communal wound. She had touched so many lives, taught so many children, mentored so many young women, that her disappearance was not a private tragedy, but a public one, felt across the whole town. The students who had loved her, the colleagues who had worked beside her, the young women she had mentored, the neighbors who had known her, all of them felt the loss, and all of them were drawn into the long ordeal that followed. That is the true scale of what Tara's disappearance took from Ocilla, not just one woman, but a beloved figure whose absence the whole community would feel for years. It is worth dwelling on the legacy that Tara left in her students, because it is a legacy that outlived her and that no crime could erase. A good teacher shapes lives in ways that ripple forward for decades. The students Tara taught carried what she gave them into their own adult lives: the knowledge, the encouragement, the sense of being seen and valued by a teacher who cared. Those gifts did not disappear when Tara did. They lived on in the people she had taught, in the choices they made and the lives they built, in the quiet, immeasurable way that a good teacher's influence persists. That is a form of immortality that no crime can take, the way a devoted teacher lives on in her students, and Tara has that. A legacy woven into the lives of the young people of Ocilla, whom she taught and encouraged. There is something both comforting and heartbreaking in that. Comforting, because it means that Tara's life had a lasting positive effect that outlived her, that she is remembered not only as a victim but as a teacher who mattered, whose influence endures. Heartbreaking, because it is a reminder of how much more she would have given had she lived, how many more students she would have taught, how much more good she would have done across a full career and a full life. The legacy she left is real and lasting, and it is also a fraction of what it should have been, cut short by the crime that took her. To be fair, every life cut short leaves that double feeling, the gratitude for what was given and the grief for what was lost, and Tara's leaves it especially strongly, because she was a person whose whole vocation was giving to others. You're in a classroom in Irwin County High School, years after Tara taught there, and her memory lingers in the place she gave so much of herself. The students she taught have grown and gone, carrying her influence with them. New students have come, some of whom know her only as a name, a story, a tragedy attached to their school. But the mark she made remains, in the memory of the place, in the lives she shaped, in the quiet legacy of a teacher who cared. That is what a good teacher leaves behind, a legacy in living people. And it is Tara's truest monument, deeper than any headline, more lasting than any case, the mark she made on the young lives entrusted to her care. On the weekend, she vanished. Tara had been doing exactly the things that a woman of her life would do. She had attended a beauty pageant, part of the world she was involved in, and afterward she had gone to a barbecue, an ordinary social gathering. She was seen at these events, a teacher and pageant mentor, moving through the ordinary social life of her small town on an autumn weekend. And then, after the barbecue, Tara went home to her house in Ocilla, and somewhere in the hours that followed, she vanished. The last anyone can reliably place her is that ordinary weekend evening, coming home from a barbecue, and then the record simply stops, and Tara Grinstead is gone. There is a poignancy in the ordinariness of that last weekend that deserves a moment. Tara spent her final 3 hours doing exactly the things that made up her life, the pageant she was involved with, the barbecue with people she knew, the ordinary social rounds of a woman woven into her community. There was nothing unusual about the weekend, nothing that marked it out, nothing that would have warned anyone that it was the last. Tara moved through it the way she moved through any weekend, a teacher and mentor among her neighbors, present and alive and ordinary, And that ordinariness is exactly what makes the ending so hard to absorb. The way a completely normal weekend, indistinguishable from 100 others, turned out to be the last of Tara's life. We should hold on to the image of Tara at those events, at the pageant she loved and the barbecue among friends, because it is a truer picture of her than anything that came after. She was alive, engaged, present, doing the things she cared about, surrounded by the community she was part of. She was not yet a mystery or a case or a name in a headline. She was just Tara, moving through an ordinary weekend, a woman in the middle of her life. That is the Tara worth remembering, the living one, present at the ordinary events of her last weekend. And it is a mercy of a small kind that her final free hours were spent among her community, doing things she valued before the ordinary weekend gave way to the mystery that followed. You're at that barbecue on the last evening of Tara's ordinary life, and it is a scene of complete, unremarkable normalcy. People are eating, talking, enjoying an autumn evening in a small southern town. Tara is among them, a familiar and welcome presence, a teacher and mentor known and liked by the people around her. There is nothing to mark the evening, nothing to suggest it is anything but one more ordinary gathering. And then the evening ends, and Tara goes home, and the ordinary weekend becomes the last, the final normal hours before the record stops and the long mystery begins. To hold that image of Tara alive and ordinary among her community is to remember her as she was before her name became a case. You're in Ocilla, Georgia, on an autumn weekend in 2005, and it is the ordinary quiet of a small southern town. The pageant has ended, the barbecue has wound down, and people are heading home through the warm October night. Tara, a beloved teacher and pageant mentor, drives home to her house, as she has countless times before. The town settles into its evening. There's nothing to mark the night as different from any other. And somewhere in the quiet of that ordinary evening, in her own home or just outside it, something happened to Tara, something that 11 years of investigation and rumor would struggle to explain, and that no court, even now, has fully resolved. The disappearance came to light in the way these things often do, when Tara did not appear where she was reliably expected. When she did not report to work at the school on Monday, the 24th of October, the alarm was raised, because a dedicated teacher does not simply fail to show up without a word. Concern brought people to her home, and what they found there was a scene that was both ordinary and deeply wrong. Tara's car was parked outside her house, where it should be, but inside, her cell phone was still there, left behind, and her purse and her keys were gone. There were no clear signs of a break-in, no obvious evidence of a violent struggle, nothing dramatic to announce what had happened. There was only the quiet wrongness of a home its owner had not returned to, with some of her things present and others missing, and Tara herself simply gone. Those details, the car outside, the phone inside, the missing purse and keys, the absence of forced entry, would become the endlessly examined physical facts of the case, and they cut in more than one direction. The phone left behind suggested she had not planned to leave. The missing purse and keys suggested she might have gone somewhere, or that someone had taken them. The lack of forced entry suggested she had let someone in, or gone out willingly, or that whoever came had not needed to force their way. Every one of these details could support more than one story, and for 11 years, people would argue about what they meant. The scene was ambiguous, and its ambiguity was part of what allowed the rumor mill to run so wild for so long. Because when the physical evidence does not clearly say what happened, human imagination rushes in to fill the void. It is worth understanding how a scene like Tara's fuels endless speculation, because it is a dynamic that plays out in many unsolved cases. When the evidence points clearly in one direction, there is less room for theories. But when the evidence is ambiguous, when it can be read to support many different stories, it becomes a kind of blank screen onto which people project their fears and suspicions. The absence of forced entry, for instance, could mean that Tara knew whoever came, or that she went out willingly, or that the person had a key, or that no force was needed for some other reason. Each of those readings supports a completely different theory, and none of them can be ruled out by the evidence alone. So people chose the reading that fit their suspicions, and the ambiguous scene became not a source of answers, but a source of endless argument. That is one of the cruelest features of an ambiguous scene, the way it enables rather than constrains speculation. A clear scene tells you what happened and shuts down the false theories. An ambiguous scene tells you very little and lets 1,000 theories bloom. Tara's scene was of the second kind, and for 11 years it functioned as fuel for the rumor mill rather than as a constraint upon it. Every detail that could have narrowed the possibilities instead widened them, because each could be read so many ways. To be fair, this is not a failing of the investigation, which worked the scene as thoroughly as it could. It is simply the nature of an ambiguous scene, which gives the human imagination room to run, and run it did, for over a decade, in the small town of Ocilla. You're standing in the ambiguity of that scene, trying to read it the way the investigators and the town tried to read it for years, and you can feel how it resists a single answer. The car outside, the phone inside, the missing purse and keys, the absence of any forced entry. Each detail seems to point somewhere, and then, when you look closer, points somewhere else. The scene is like a sentence with the crucial word missing, legible enough to demand interpretation, but incomplete enough to permit any interpretation you bring to it. That is what the people of Ocilla stared at for 11 years, an ambiguous scene that would not resolve, and it is part of why the rumor mill ran so long and so wild, because the evidence itself gave them nothing firm to hold on to. Recognizing the seriousness of the situation, local authorities quickly brought in the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, the state-level agency with the resources to handle a major case. From the beginning, this was treated as a serious matter, a genuine disappearance of a prominent local person, and the investigation was substantial. But despite that early and serious response, the case did not break. The investigators worked the scene, followed the leads, questioned the people in Tara's life, and yet no clear answer emerged. Tara had vanished from her own home on an ordinary weekend, leaving behind an ambiguous scene and no obvious trail, and the case that opened that October would remain open and would torment a town for more than 11 years. It is worth noting that despite the lack of a resolution, Tara's case never truly went cold in the way that many unsolved cases do. It generated leads constantly, year after year, a steady stream of tips and theories and possibilities that investigators had to work through. The case remained active, remained investigated, remained in the minds of the authorities and the public alike. That is unusual. Many unsolved cases fade, the leads drying up, the file gathering dust, the public moving on. Tara's did not. Its high profile, the beloved status of the victim, the intensity of the small town attention, all kept it alive and active for the whole of those 11 years. A case that was unsolved, but never forgotten, worked, but never cracked. That sustained attention was, in its way, both a blessing and a curse. The blessing was that the case never died, that the effort to solve it never fully stopped, that the possibility of an answer remained alive. The curse was that the constant attention also kept the rumor mill turning, kept the wound open, kept the town in a state of perpetual, unresolved agitation. A case that fades at least allows a community to slowly heal, however incompletely. A case that stays intensely alive for 11 years without resolution keeps the wound perpetually fresh, the suspicion perpetually active, the town perpetually unsettled. Ocilla lived with that, the mixed blessing of a case that would not die and would not resolve for over a decade. You're in the investigator's position across those 11 years, working a case that generates endless leads and yields no answer. And it is a particular kind of frustration. Every lead must be run down, because the one you dismiss might be the one that matters. Every tip must be weighed, every theory considered, every year bringing new possibilities and new dead ends. The case is never closed, never solved, but never quiet either. An endless procession of leads that go nowhere, of hopes raised and dashed. To be fair, the investigators who worked Tara's case across those years showed real dedication, refusing to let it go, keeping it alive until, at last, the break came. But the years of working an active case that would not crack were their own long ordeal, a decade of effort meeting a silence that would not break. You're in Tara's quiet home in the days after she vanished, and it is a scene of ordinary life interrupted and unexplained. Her car sits outside. Her phone rests inside, silent. The ordinary objects of her life are there, but some are missing, and she's gone. Investigators move through the rooms looking for the thing that will explain what happened, and the house gives them ambiguity instead of answers. It is the kind of scene that generates 1,000 theories precisely because it confirms none of them. A quiet, ordinary home that has swallowed its owner and kept it secret. And out of that ambiguous silence, in the weeks and months and years to come, the rumors would grow. Now, we come to what may be the most important and the most cautionary part of Tara's story. The 11 years of rumor that filled the void where an answer should have been. Because here is a truth about small towns, spoken with no disrespect. For small towns hold much that is good. In a place where everyone knows everyone, where lives are intertwined and histories are shared, the disappearance of a beloved figure sets off something powerful and dangerous. People cannot bear not knowing. The human mind reaches desperately for an explanation, for a face to attach to the horror. And in a small town, there is no shortage of faces to consider, because everyone knows everyone, and everyone has a theory, and the theories spread from porch to porch and pew to pew until they harden in the town's imagination into something that feels like knowledge but is not. For 11 years, that is exactly what happened in Ocilla. In the absence of an answer, suspicion fell, at one time or another, on a whole series of people, most of them entirely innocent. There was talk about the people in Tara's life, about anyone who had known her, dated her, worked with her, crossed her path. Names were whispered, reputations were quietly stained. People who had done nothing wrong found themselves the subject of their neighbors' suspicion, living under a cloud of rumor they could not dispel. Because you cannot disprove a rumor, you can only endure it. In a small town, that kind of suspicion is inescapable. There's nowhere to hide from the whispers of people who have known you your whole life, and for years, innocent people in Ocilla lived under exactly that weight. It is worth understanding why small towns are so prone to this, because it is not a matter of small towns being worse than other places, but of a particular dynamic that the closeness of a small community creates. In a big city, a disappearance is investigated by professionals and largely forgotten by the public because the victim was a stranger to almost everyone. In a small town, the opposite is true. Everyone knew the victim or knew someone who did. Everyone has a personal stake in the answer, and everyone has a web of knowledge, real and imagined, about the people around them. The old grievances, the past relationships, the secrets and the histories that make up the intimate life of a small place. When a disappearance goes unsolved, all of that intimate knowledge becomes fuel for speculation, and the very closeness that makes a small town warm becomes the engine of a rumor mill that can destroy the innocent. You're in a small town living under the weight of an unsolved disappearance, and you can feel how the closeness that once felt like safety begins to feel like a trap. Everyone is watching everyone. Every glance carries a question. The people you've known your whole life are wondering about you and you about them, and the easy trust that a small town runs on begins to erode into suspicion. If your name has been whispered, there is no escape from it, because everyone knows you, and the whisper follows you to church and to the store and down every street. That is the corrosive power of the rumor mill in a small place, the way it turns the intimacy of a community against itself. And it is exactly what happened in Ocilla for 11 long years, poisoning the town from within as it waited for an answer that would not come. To be fair, the people who spread the rumors were not, for the most part, malicious. They were frightened, grieving, desperate for an answer, doing what frightened and grieving people do, which is to reach for an explanation, to try to make sense of a horror by attaching it to a face. That impulse is human and forgivable in its origin, but its effects were not harmless. Real people were hurt by it, their reputation stained, their lives shadowed, their standing in the only community they had damaged by theories that had no evidence behind them. The rumor mill is a case where an understandable human impulse produces a genuine injustice, and Tara's case is one of the clearest and most painful examples of it. A whole town's fear and grief curdling over 11 years into the quiet persecution of the innocent. We are going to be very careful here, and we are not going to repeat the specific rumors or name the innocent people they targeted, because to do so would be to continue the very harm we are describing. It is enough to understand the pattern and to name it clearly for what it was, an injustice. The people who were wrongly suspected in the rumor mill of Ocilla were, most of them, entirely innocent, guilty of nothing but having known Tara, or having been available for the town's suspicion to land upon. None of them was charged. None of them was shown to have done anything wrong. And yet they carried, for years, the terrible burden of being suspected by their own community of involvement in the disappearance of a beloved woman. That is a real harm done to real people, and it is one of the true and terrible costs of a case that goes unsolved for so long. Have you ever wondered how much damage a rumor can do How a whisper with no evidence behind it can follow an innocent person for years, can poison their relationships and their standing and their peace, all without a single fact to support it. Tara's case is a devastating illustration of exactly that. The 11 years of not knowing did not only torment Tara's family and the town's longing for justice, they also visited a quiet injustice on the innocent people who fell under suspicion, who had to live under the weight of their neighbors' unfounded theories in a small town where there was no escaping the whispers. That is why we handle the rumor mill not as entertainment, but as a warning, because the harm it did was real, and because the temptation to speculate, to whisper, to accuse without evidence is exactly the temptation that did so much damage in Ocilla for so long. Alongside the rumors, there were real investigative leads over the years, and some of them illustrate just how tangled and frustrating the case became. At one point, investigators recovered a latex glove in the yard of Tara's property, and it carried DNA, raising hopes that it might identify whoever had been there. But the DNA did not match anyone in the available databases, and the glove, tantalizing as it was, did not crack the case. It became one more piece of evidence that pointed toward an unknown person without naming them, a clue that deepened the mystery rather than resolving it. For years, that glove and its unidentified DNA hung over the case, a physical trace of someone whose identity could not be established. There was also, in the strange history of this case, a false confession that led investigators astray for a time. A man falsely claimed involvement in what turned out to be a hoax, and his claim had to be investigated and ultimately debunked and set aside. False confessions are a real and recurring problem in high-profile cases, drawing the attention of people who, for reasons of their own, insert themselves into a tragedy they had nothing to do with. This hoax was one more twist in a case already thick with them, one more false trail that consumed investigative energy and raised and then dashed hopes before being exposed for what it was. It is a reminder of how much noise surrounds a famous, unsolved case, and how much of the investigator's work is separating the real from the false. Through all of it, the years piled up without an answer, and Tara's family lived in the terrible suspension that these cases impose. Tara had a family who loved her, including a sister who would become a central figure in keeping the case alive. And for them, the 11 years were an agony of not knowing, made worse by the swirl of rumor around their loved one's disappearance. They did not know what had happened to Tara. They did not know where she was. They had to endure not only the loss but the endless public speculation, the theories and the whispers, the case becoming a kind of local legend, even as it remained, for them, the rawest of personal wounds. To be fair, they also had the support of a community that cared, but the not knowing, stretched across more than a decade, was its own distinct torment, and the family bore it year after year. You're in Ocilla across those 11 years, watching a town live with an unsolved disappearance in its midst, and it is a portrait of a community slowly worn down by a wound that will not heal. Every year, the anniversary comes and goes without an answer. Every year, the rumors circulate anew. The case becomes part of the town's identity, a shadow over the place, a question that hangs in the air at the grocery store and the church and the high school where Tara once taught. People grow suspicious of one another. Old friendships strain under the weight of unspoken theories. A whole community lives in the long, corrosive uncertainty of an unsolved case, and it changes the town, subtly and painfully, year after year, as the truth stays hidden and the rumors fill the silence. As the years passed and the case remained unsolved, it drew attention far beyond Ocilla, and in 2016 and 2017, that attention reached a new pitch through a podcast. A true crime podcast called Up and Vanished took up Tara's case, examining it in depth over many episodes, and it reached an enormous audience, bringing national and even international attention to a disappearance that had, until then, been mostly a regional tragedy. The renewed interest generated new tips, new discussion, and new pressure on the case. To be fair, the role of such media attention in solving cases is complicated, and it can bring harm as well as help, amplifying rumor along with legitimate interest. But in Tara's case, the surge of attention coincided with, and by many accounts contributed to, a genuine break after 11 long years. The role of true crime media in cases like Tara's is worth pausing on because it is genuinely double-edged, and Tara's case shows both edges. On the positive side, the attention a podcast or documentary brings can reignite a stalled case, generate new tips, apply pressure that moves investigators and prosecutors, and reach the one person who holds a crucial piece of information. There is no doubt that the surge of interest in Tara's case brought it back into the light after years of stagnation, and that the renewed attention was part of the environment in which the case finally broke. For a family that had waited 11 years, that attention was, in that sense, a gift, a force that helped move a frozen case toward resolution. But there is another edge, and it cuts the other way, and honesty requires us to acknowledge it. The same media attention that can help solve a case can also amplify rumor, invade the privacy of the grieving, turn a real tragedy into entertainment, and subject innocent people to the scrutiny and suspicion of a vast audience. When millions of people become amateur investigators of a real case, they bring not only helpful tips, but also baseless theories, and the innocent people already suffering under a local rumor mill can find themselves suddenly suspected by the entire internet. To be fair, the best true crime work is careful and responsible, and can do real good. But the genre also carries real risks, and Tara's case, with its long history of harm to the innocent, is a reminder that attention is a powerful force that can wound as well as heal, which is to say that we try, on this channel, to be on the responsible side of that line, to bring attention to cases in a way that helps rather than harms, that centers victims rather than exploiting them, that protects the innocent rather than accusing them. Tara's case, more than most, demands that care, because it is a case in which suspicion did so much damage for so long. We tell it not to feed the rumor mill, but to honor Tara and to warn against the very speculation that harmed her town. And we tell the legal outcomes with precision, precisely because careless telling, the kind that calls an acquitted man a murderer or repeats a rumor as fact, is exactly the kind of harm that this case, of all cases, should teach us to avoid. In February of 2017, the break finally came, and the 11-year silence was shattered by a pair of arrests. A man named Ryan Alexander Duke, who had been a student at the high school where Tara taught, was arrested and charged in connection with her death. Days later, a second man, Bo Dukes, no relation despite the similar name, was arrested as well. After more than a decade, it seemed that the case had finally cracked. that the answer to what had happened to Tara Grinstead was at last at hand. The town and the family and the vast audience following the case braced for the resolution they had waited 11 years to receive. But the legal story that unfolded over the next several years would prove far more complicated and far less conclusive than anyone expected. For the town of Ocilla, the arrests were a profound shock and worth understanding as such. After 11 years of rumor that had swirled around so many people, the men taken into custody were, themselves, connected to the community. One of them a former student of the very school where Tara had taught. In a small town, that kind of revelation lands hard. It means that the answer, if it was the answer, had been living among them all along, that the mystery had not come from outside, but from within the community itself. There is a particular kind of horror in that for a small town, the sense that the darkness was closer than anyone had imagined, woven into the ordinary fabric of local life. The arrest broke the 11-year silence, but they also delivered a fresh shock, the shock of recognition, the discovery that the tragedy had roots in the community's own soil. You're in Ocilla in the days after the arrests, and the town is reeling all over again, the old wound reopened, and a new horror added to it. For 11 years the town had wondered. Now there were names and faces, and the names and faces were, in a sense, their own. The relief of a possible answer was tangled up with the fresh grief of learning where the answer had come from. And beneath it all was the return of Tara herself to the front of everyone's mind, the reminder of the beloved teacher whose fate had, perhaps, finally begun to come clear. It was a moment of overwhelming and complicated emotion for a town that had carried this wound for over a decade, a moment when the long-awaited break brought as much pain as relief. To be fair, the arrests did not mean the case was over, and the careful among the townspeople understood that. An arrest is an accusation, not a conviction, the beginning of a legal process, not its end. The men who were arrested were, at that point, accused, entitled to the presumption of innocence, and the questions of what they had actually done and what could be proven would have to be answered in court over years of proceedings. The town and the family and the watching world would have to wait through those proceedings to learn what the legal system would ultimately conclude. And as we have seen, what it concluded would be far more complicated than the simple resolution that the arrests seemed, at first, to promise. Now we have to be extremely precise, because what happened in the courts is the most important and the most misunderstood part of this whole case, and getting it exactly right is a matter of justice for real, living people. So let us walk through it carefully and slowly. The two men were charged with very different things. Ryan Duke was charged with the most serious offenses, including Tara's murder. Bo Dukes was charged not with murder, but with helping to conceal her death and related offenses, based on his account that he had knowledge of what happened and had been involved in hiding her body afterward. From the beginning then, the two men faced fundamentally different accusations, one charged with the killing itself, the other with helping to conceal it after the fact. Let's take Bo Dukes first because his case was resolved earlier and more simply. In 2019, Bo Dukes was tried and convicted, but it is essential to be clear about what he was convicted of. He was found guilty of concealing Tara's death, of hindering the apprehension of a criminal, and of tampering with evidence. He was sentenced to 25 years, but he was not convicted of murdering Tara Grinstead, and he was not charged with murdering her. His conviction was for his role in concealing her death and hiding what had happened, not for the killing itself. That distinction matters enormously, and it must be held clearly, because to say that Bo Dukes was convicted in the Grinstead case is true, but to say he was convicted of her murder would be false. He was convicted of concealment, which is a serious crime, but a different one. Now we come to Ryan Duke, and here the need for precision is at its absolute greatest, because Ryan Duke's case reached the outcome that most people misremember or misstate, and getting it right is a matter of basic justice. Ryan Duke was charged with Tara's murder, and in May of 2022, his case went to trial. The prosecution presented its case, the defense presented its case, and the jury reached its verdict. And the verdict was this: Ryan Duke was found not guilty of murder. He was found not guilty of aggravated assault. He was found not guilty of burglary. The jury acquitted him of the killing and of the most serious charges against him. He was convicted only of one lesser offense, concealing Tara's death, for which he received a sentence on the order of 10 years. On the central question, the question of whether Ryan Duke murdered Tara Grinstead, the jury said no. We have to sit with what that means, because it is the crucial fact of this case, and it is so often gotten wrong. Ryan Duke was acquitted of murdering Tara Grinstead. Under the law, and in the account we are giving tonight, that means he did not murder her, that the charge was tried before a jury and rejected. He is not Tara's murderer, and it would be both false and unjust to call him that. He was convicted only of concealing her death, the same category of offense as Bo Dukes, not of the killing itself. His defense, in fact, argued that he was not the killer at all. The jury, having heard the evidence, declined to convict him of murder. That is the legal reality, and we are bound by it, and we state it clearly. Ryan Duke was acquitted of Tara Grinstead's murder, and so we arrive at the extraordinary and unsettling fact that sits at the center of this case, even now, after all the arrests and trials. No one has ever been convicted of murdering Tara Grinstead. 2 men were convicted of concealing her death, of helping to hide what happened to her, but the killing itself, the actual murder, has never resulted in a conviction. Bo Dukes was convicted of concealment. Ryan Duke was acquitted of murder and convicted only of concealment, which is to say that in the eyes of the law, the person who killed Tara Grinstead has never been established, has never been convicted, remains, in the most important legal sense, unidentified. The case that seemed, in 2017, to have finally been solved turned out, in the courts, to leave the central question unanswered. You're in the courtroom in 2022 as that verdict is read, and it is a moment of the most complicated and unsatisfying resolution imaginable. After 17 years, after 11 years of rumor and then 5 years of legal proceedings, the jury delivers a verdict that convicts the defendant of concealing Tara's death, but acquits him of killing her. For a family and a town that had waited so long for an answer, it was a resolution that resolved almost nothing about the central question of who was responsible for Tara's death. There were convictions for concealment, and there was, at last, some measure of legal accountability. But the murder itself, the thing everyone most wanted answered, remained, even after all of that, without a convicted killer. It is one of the strangest and most frustrating outcomes in any case we have ever told. We should be careful and fair about both men, precisely because the outcomes were what they were. Bo Dukes was convicted of concealment and is serving his sentence, and that is a matter of record. Ryan Duke was acquitted of murder, and that acquittal must be respected, which means we do not call him a murderer. Do not imply that the jury got it wrong. Do not substitute our own judgment for the verdict of the court. To be fair, many people have strong opinions about this case and its outcome, and feel that justice was not fully done. And those feelings are understandable given the pain of the case. But the legal system reached the conclusions it reached, and in a society governed by law, those conclusions are what stand. Ryan Duke was acquitted of murder, and he is, in the eyes of the law, not guilty of it. And we honor that, because the presumption of innocence and the finality of an acquittal are the bedrock protections that shield all of us. It is worth explaining why these protections matter so much, because in the heat of a painful case, people sometimes resent them, sometimes feel that a legal technicality has robbed them of justice. But the presumption of innocence and the finality of an acquittal are not technicalities. They are among the most important safeguards a free society has. The presumption of innocence means that the burden is on the state to prove guilt, not on the accused to prove innocence, and that protects every one of us from being convicted on suspicion, on rumor, on the certainty of a crowd. The finality of an acquittal means that a person, once tried and found not guilty, cannot be endlessly retried or hounded, that at some point the matter is settled and they are free. These protections exist precisely for the hard cases, the emotional cases, the cases where a community is certain and wants a conviction. They exist to make sure that certainty alone is never enough. In Tara's case, those protections did what they are meant to do. A jury heard the evidence against Ryan Duke on the murder charge, weighed it against the standard the law requires, which is proof beyond a reasonable doubt, and concluded that the standard had not been met. That is the system working as designed, not failing. It may be deeply unsatisfying, especially to those who are certain of their own conclusions. But the alternative, a system that convicts on less than proof beyond a reasonable doubt, is a system that would convict the innocent along with the guilty. To be fair, reasonable people can be frustrated by an acquittal, can wish the outcome had been different, and that frustration is understandable. But the principle that protected Ryan Duke is the same principle that protects every innocent person who is ever wrongly suspected. And in a case that saw so many innocent people wrongly suspected over 11 years, the value of that principle should be especially clear. Have you ever wondered why we insist on such a high standard of proof, even when it means that some cases end without the conviction that a community craves? It is because the cost of the alternative is so terrible. A system that convicts on suspicion, on rumor, on the passionate certainty of a grieving town, is a system that will destroy innocent lives. The 11 years of rumor that harmed so many innocent people in Ocilla is a small preview of what a whole society would look like if certainty alone were enough to condemn. The high standard of proof, frustrating as it can be, is the thing that stands between us and that world, which is to say that even the unsatisfying outcome of Tara's case is, in a deeper sense, the legal system honoring the very protections that the rumor mill so badly violated, insisting on proof where the town had insisted on suspicion. There is a hard lesson in this case about the gap between what a community believes and what a court can prove. and it connects directly to the rumor mill we spoke of earlier. For 11 years, the town was certain that someone, somewhere, held the answer, and the rumor mill named one innocent person after another. Then, when the case finally reached the courts, the legal system, with its high standards of proof, convicted 2 men of concealment, but could not establish, to the standard the law requires, who committed the murder itself. That gap between the certainty of suspicion and the rigor of proof is exactly the space in which injustice lives. The rumor mill was certain about many people, and it was wrong about all of them. The courts were careful, and they reached conclusions that satisfied almost no one, but that were arrived at through the proper process, which is to say that the case is a lesson in the difference between believing you know and being able to prove it, a difference that matters enormously because on it rests the protection of the innocent. This lesson reaches beyond Tara's case into how all of us engage with the countless unsolved and contested cases that fill our news and our entertainment. The temptation always is to decide for ourselves who is guilty, to weigh the evidence in our own minds and reach our own verdict to be certain. And there is nothing wrong with thinking about a case, with forming impressions, with being curious. But there is a crucial line between private curiosity and public accusation, between wondering and declaring. When we cross that line, when we announce, on the strength of our own certainty, that a particular person is guilty, we do exactly what the rumor mill did in Ocilla. We substitute our conviction for proof, and we risk doing real harm to real people. Tara's case, with its long history of harm to the innocent and its final, careful legal outcome, is a powerful argument for staying on the right side of that line. The discipline it asks of us is not easy, because certainty feels good and ambiguity feels uncomfortable. It is satisfying to decide who did it, to have an answer, to feel the case resolved in our own minds. It is uncomfortable to sit with the truth that we do not know, that the evidence is ambiguous, that the legal system reached a conclusion different from the one our gut might prefer. But that discomfort is the price of fairness, and fairness is what protects the innocent. To be fair, none of us is perfectly disciplined about this, and the pull towards certainty is strong. But Tara's case is a reminder to try, to hold our conclusions loosely, to respect the difference between what we believe and what has been proven, because on that difference, as the 11 years in Ocilla showed, real lives depend. Have you ever wondered how different the world would be if we all held our suspicions a little more loosely? If we resisted the urge to convict people in our minds on less than proof? Tara's case offers a glimpse of both the danger and the alternative. The danger is the rumor mill, the 11 years of certainty that harmed the innocent. The alternative is the discipline of the courts, the insistence on proof, the willingness to sit with an unsatisfying but honest outcome rather than a satisfying but unfounded one. Which is to say that Tara's case, for all its pain, carries a genuine lesson, a warning against the easy cruelty of unfounded certainty, and a quiet argument for the harder, fairer discipline of holding our judgments until they are earned. Have you ever wondered how a case can be, in some sense, both solved and unsolved at the same time? How there can be convictions and yet no answer to the central question? Tara's case is exactly that paradox. It is solved, in that 2 men were convicted of concealing her death, and the long silence was broken, and a version of what happened came into public view. And it is unsolved. in that no one has been convicted of the murder itself, in that the central question of who killed Tara Grinstead has never been legally answered. Both things are true at once, and holding them both is the only honest way to understand the case. It is not the clean resolution the town waited 11 years for. It is something murkier and harder, a partial answer that leaves the deepest question open. To be fair, the concealment convictions did establish some important things, and they should not be dismissed. They established, through the legal process, that Tara had died, and that her death had been concealed, and that specific individuals had been involved in that concealment. That is more than the town had for 11 years, when there was nothing but rumor and an open question. The convictions brought a measure of accountability and a measure of established fact where there had been only speculation. But they did not bring the full answer, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. The murder of Tara Grinstead has never produced a conviction, and that fact, uncomfortable as it is the truth of where the case stands. Through all of the years, the rumors, the arrests, and the trials, Tara's family carried the weight of it, and their endurance deserves recognition. Tara had a sister who became a steady voice for her over the years, one of the people who refused to let Tara be forgotten, who kept her memory and her case alive through the long ordeal. For the family, the resolution, such as it was, must have been a complicated and painful thing, bringing some measure of established fact and accountability, but not the full answer, not a conviction for the murder itself, not the complete justice that a family in their position longs for. They had waited more than a decade, endured the rumor mill, sat through the trials, and arrived at an outcome that answered some questions and left the deepest one open. To carry all of that across so many years is an ordeal few families ever face, and Tara's family faced it with a persistence born of love. The family's ordeal deserves fuller recognition because it was uniquely complicated by everything that surrounded Tara's case. Most grieving families endure a loss and, if they are fortunate, an eventual answer. Tara's family endured all of that and more: the loss, the 11 years of not knowing, the constant public speculation, the rumor mill that swirled around their loved one's disappearance, and then, at last, a resolution that resolved the central question incompletely. They had to grieve in public, with their private tragedy playing out as a local legend and then a national podcast subject. They had to endure the theories and the whispers, the attention and the intrusion, all while carrying the simple, enormous grief of losing Tara. It is hard to imagine a more complicated bereavement, and the family bore it year after year with a dignity that deserves respect. Tara's sister, in particular, became a steady voice for her over the years, one of the people who refused to let Tara be forgotten, who kept her memory and her case before the public, who advocated for the truth to come out. That is a heavy role to carry, the keeper of a missing loved one's memory, the one who must stay public with the family's grief in the hope of an answer. It requires reliving the loss again and again, speaking about it to strangers, keeping the wound open in the service of justice. Tara's sister and her family took on that burden and carried it across the long years, and their persistence was part of what kept Tara's case alive and eventually helped bring it, however incompletely, toward resolution. You're watching a family endure a grief made almost impossibly complicated by publicity, rumor, and an unresolved answer, and you can feel the weight of it. There is the simple loss of Tara, which alone would be devastating, and layered over it is everything else: the years of not knowing, the public speculation, the legal proceedings that ended without a murder conviction. The family had to hold all of that at once, to grieve and to advocate and to endure the public churning of their private tragedy for the better part of 2 decades. That they did so, that they kept Tara's memory alive and kept seeking the truth through all of it, is a testament to a love and a persistence that these terrible cases so often reveal in the families left behind. In the years since the trials, the legal proceedings have continued to wind on, with additional charges considered and, on appeal, thrown out, leaving the original convictions and sentences in place. The case has not fully closed the book, in the way these things sometimes drag on through the courts. But the essential situation remains what the trials established. 2 men convicted of concealing Tara's death. No one convicted of the murder. A family and a town left with a partial answer, and with the enduring, unresolved question of who, exactly, was responsible for the death of a beloved teacher. It is not the ending anyone wanted, and it is the ending, so far, that the case has. There is a particular difficulty in living with a partial answer, and it is worth naming, because it is the situation Tara's family and town now occupy. A complete answer, however painful, allows a kind of closure. The truth is known, justice is done, and the grieving can at last move toward whatever peace is possible. A total absence of an answer, as in a case that is never solved, is its own clear torment, but at least it is a known quantity, the clean, hard fact of not knowing. A partial answer is a stranger and more unsettling thing. It gives you some of the truth but not all of it, some accountability but not full justice, a resolution that resolves and fails to resolve at the same time. It leaves you in a middle place, knowing more than you did but less than you need, and that middle place can be its own kind of difficult ground to stand on. For Tara's family and town, that is where the case has left them. They know more than they did during the 11 years of silence. They know that Tara died, that her death was concealed, that specific individuals were involved in that concealment and were convicted for it. But they do not have the full answer, the conviction for the murder itself, the complete account of who did what and why. They have accountability for the concealment, but not for the killing. A partial justice that answers some questions and leaves the deepest one open. To be fair, that is more than many families ever receive, and it is not nothing. But it is not everything, not the complete truth and complete justice that a family in their position longs for, and living with that incompleteness is its own ongoing burden. There is another dimension to the family's loss that deserves a gentle mention, because it compounds everything else. The concealment of Tara's death was thorough enough that her remains were never recovered in the way that would allow a family to fully lay their loved one to rest. We will not dwell on the painful details of the concealment, out of respect for Tara and her family, and there is no need to. But it is worth understanding, gently, that the family was denied not only the full answer and the murder conviction, but also, in a real sense, the ability to bring Tara home. That is an additional and profound grief. The inability to recover a loved one, to have a place to visit, to perform the ancient rituals of mourning. It is one more way that the concealment of Tara's death wounded the people who loved her, denying them even the incomplete comfort of a physical farewell. We say this softly because it is among the most painful aspects of the case, and because it deserves to be held with care rather than described in detail. What matters is the human truth of it, that Tara's family in addition to everything else they have endured, has had to grieve without the ability to fully lay their loved one to rest. That is a hard and particular sorrow, and it is part of why the case remains so painful even now, years after the trials. The family was left with a partial answer, an incomplete justice, and an incomplete farewell all at once. And through all of it, they have kept their love for Tara and their hope for the full truth alive. Have you ever wondered whether a partial answer can be, in some ways, harder to live with than none at all? The way a door left ajar can be more unsettling than one firmly closed or firmly open. Tara's case raises exactly that question. The family and town were given enough to know the general shape of what happened, but not enough to see it fully resolved, not enough to have the complete accounting that true closure requires. That in-between state, neither the clean closure of a solved case nor the clear torment of an unsolved one, is a hard place to live. And it is where Tara's story, for now, leaves everyone who loved her in the difficult middle ground of a partial truth, still hoping, perhaps, that the full answer will one day come. For the town of Ocilla, the years since the trials have brought a slow and incomplete kind of healing, the healing that a community manages when a long wound is partly, but not fully, closed. The 11 years of active rumor have largely subsided because the case did, at last, produce something, a set of convictions, a broad account of what happened, an end to the total silence that had fed the speculation. In that sense, the town is in a different place than it was during the long years of not knowing. But the incompleteness of the answer means the healing is incomplete too. There's still the knowledge that no one was convicted of the murder itself. Still the questions that the trials left open. Still the shadow of a case that was resolved and not resolved at once. Ocilla lives now with a quieter version of the old wound, no longer raw, but not fully healed either. The innocent people who are harmed by the rumor mill deserve a place in that healing, and it is worth naming their situation with compassion. For years they lived under suspicion they did not deserve, and while the arrests eventually pointed the town's attention elsewhere, the damage done to reputations and relationships by years of whispers does not simply vanish. A rumor, once spread, is hard to fully retract, and the people wrongly suspected in Ocilla carried, and perhaps still carry, some residue of those years of unfounded suspicion. To be fair, the resolution of the case, incomplete as it was, at least redirected the town's suspicion away from the innocent, which is a real relief. But the harm done to them over 11 years is part of the true cost of this case, and it should not be forgotten in any honest telling. You're in Ocilla now, years after the trials, in a town slowly learning to live with a partial answer, and it is a quieter place than it was during the years of rumor, but not a fully healed one. The beloved teacher is still remembered, still mourned, her case still a part of the town's identity. The convictions brought some closure, some sense that the silence was finally broken. But the incompleteness remains, the knowledge that the deepest question was never fully answered. Ocilla carries Tara's memory still, and carries too the complicated legacy of the 11 years of not knowing, a town marked forever by the disappearance of one of its own and by the long, hard reckoning that followed. Through all the years, the people who loved Tara have kept her memory alive, and that remembrance is worth honoring. Her students remember her, and her family remembers her, and the community she served remembers her still. She is spoken of, thought of, and missed. On the anniversaries of her disappearance, her name returns to the town's attention, not only as a case, but as a person, a beloved teacher who was lost. That steady remembrance is a form of love, and it is a form of resistance too. The refusal to let Tara be reduced to the crime that took her or the legal drama that followed. She was a teacher, a mentor, a sister, a friend. The people who knew her have made sure that this, and not only the mystery, is what she is remembered for. It matters that a person be remembered rightly, especially a person whose name became attached to something so painful and so public. Tara did not choose to become a famous case. She was a private citizen, a working teacher, a woman living an ordinary good life, until a crime made her name known across the country. The people who loved her have worked to make sure that the fame did not erase the person, that beneath the case and the podcast and the trials, the real Tara is still remembered, the warm and dedicated woman she actually was. That is a gift the living can give the dead, the gift of being remembered as a person and not only as a story. And Tara's people have given it to her, faithfully, across all these years. You're among the people who keep Tara's memory now, the students and family and neighbors who knew her, and you can feel how their remembrance holds her as a person rather than a case. To them, she is not the mystery of Ocilla or the subject of a podcast. She is Tara, the teacher who cared, the mentor who gave her time, the sister and friend who was loved. That memory, held by the people who actually knew her, is the truest picture of who Tara was, and it is the picture we have tried tonight to keep at the center of her story, beneath all the complexity that her disappearance produced. Tara Grinstead was a real, beloved person, and she is remembered as one. And that remembrance is her truest and most lasting monument. You're looking at the whole arc of this case now, from a beloved teacher's disappearance on an ordinary autumn weekend, through 11 years of rumor that harmed the innocent, to a resolution that convicted 2 men of concealment and yet left the murder itself without a convicted killer. It is a story about a missing woman, and about a small town, and about the terrible power of not knowing, and about the gap between suspicion and proof. It is a story with a partial ending, a case that is closed in some ways and open in others. And through it all, the one constant, the thing that should never be lost amid the legal complexity, is Tara herself, the beloved teacher whose life was taken and whose full answer the world is still, in the deepest sense, waiting for. It is worth asking why Tara's case has resonated so far beyond Ocilla, why it became a national and even international story, because the answer says something about the case and about us. Part of it is Tara herself, a beautiful, accomplished, beloved teacher, a figure who is easy to care about and to mourn. Part of it is the setting, the small southern town where everyone knows everyone, which gives the story an intimacy and an atmosphere that draws people in. Part of it is the sheer length of the mystery, 11 years unsolved, and then the dramatic arrests and the unexpected, unsatisfying trials. And part of it, the podcast era of true crime, gave the case a vehicle to reach millions, turning a regional tragedy into a national obsession. But there is something deeper too, in why Tara's case holds people, and it is the same thing that makes it such an important cautionary tale. Tara's case is, at its heart, about the terrible power of not knowing, about what an unanswered question does to a family and a community about how suspicion fills the void where truth should be and harms the innocent in the process. That is a story with universal resonance because everyone has felt, in some smaller way, the corrosive power of an unanswered question, the way not knowing can eat at a person or a place. Tara's case is that dynamic writ large, played out over 11 years in a small town, and its power comes partly from how clearly it shows us something we all recognize: the human hunger for an answer and the damage that hunger can do when no answer comes. To be fair, the fascination with Tara's case has not always been healthy, and the case is a reminder of how true crime interest can slide from concern into something more voyeuristic and more harmful. The same qualities that make the case compelling, the beloved victim, the small town atmosphere, the long mystery, can also turn it into mere entertainment, can reduce a real woman and a real tragedy to a story consumed for thrills. The challenge for anyone who engages with a case like Tara's is to hold on to the humanity at its center, to remember that Tara was a real person, that the rumor mill harmed real people, that the family's grief is real. That is what we try to do, to let the case's genuine resonance serve remembrance and caution rather than mere fascination, to keep Tara, the person at the center of the story her disappearance became. And you know anything at all about what truly happened to Tara Grinstead, anything that could help finally establish the full truth of her death, please contact the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. Even after all these years and all these proceedings, the complete answer to what happened to Tara has never been fully established, and information could still matter. Please verify the current tip lines before relying on them, because such details change over time. The concealment of Tara's death was, in the end, uncovered. And perhaps, one day, the full truth of the murder itself will be too. Until then, the case remains, in its deepest question, unanswered. There is reason to believe that the full truth could still come to light, even now, because cases evolve and truths surface in ways we cannot always predict. The break that came in 2017, after 11 years of silence, shows that a case can remain capable of movement long after it seems frozen. New information can emerge. People who have held back can come forward. Evidence can be re-examined with new methods or new eyes. The trials of the past several years established a great deal, even if they left the central question of the murder open, and that established foundation could, in principle, support further developments in the future. To be fair, there is no guarantee, and the legal complexities of a case that has already been to trial are considerable. But the full truth of what happened to Tara is not necessarily gone forever. It may yet, one day, come more fully into the light. For now, though, the honest statement is that the deepest question remains open, that no one has been convicted of murdering Tara Grinstead, and that the full account of her death has never been established in a court of law. That is an uncomfortable place to leave a story, and we would prefer, as everyone would, to offer a clean resolution. But honesty requires us to state the truth as it stands, which is that the case produced convictions for concealment and no conviction for the murder itself, and that the complete answer, the one the family and the town most deeply seek, has not yet arrived. Which is to say that Tara's case, even after everything, remains in an important sense unfinished, and that unfinished is not the same as hopeless. Have you ever wondered whether the truths that resist us for the longest are sometimes the ones that finally, unexpectedly, come to light? that a question can stay open for years and then, one day, be answered. Tara's case has already shown that pattern once, breaking after 11 years of silence. Whether it will show it again, whether the deepest question will one day be more fully answered, no one can say. But the possibility remains, held open by the same forces that eventually broke the long silence, the persistence of a family, the diligence of investigators, the chance that someone, someday, will finally tell the complete truth. Until that day, Tara's case waits, its concealment uncovered but its central question still open, for the full answer that has, so far, eluded everyone who has sought it. Let's come back, at the end, to Tara herself, because in all the legal complexity, the arrests and trials and verdicts, it is easy to lose the woman at the center, and she deserves to be remembered as far more than the case her name became. Tara Grinstead was 30 years old, a gifted and beloved high school teacher who had shaped the lives of countless students, a former pageant competitor who mentored young women, a warm and accomplished woman deeply woven into the life of her small town. She was the kind of teacher students remember forever, the kind of neighbor a community treasures. She had a family who loved her, a sister who has carried her memory, a whole life of good work and warm relationships. She was not a case or a legend or a podcast episode. She was a real, beloved woman, and it is that woman who deserves to be at the center of her own story. There is a real danger with a case like Tara's that she becomes known for everything except herself. Think of how the case is often described. It is the case with the 11-year rumor mill. It is the case that a famous podcast made national. It is the case with the two men and the surprising acquittal. In all of those descriptions, Tara herself is almost incidental, a name attached to a drama that has taken on a life of its own. That is a subtle kind of erasure, the way a person can be pushed to the margins of their own tragedy by everything that surrounds it. And it is exactly what we try to resist by returning again and again to Tara, the person, the teacher, the mentor, the woman who was loved. Because in the end, the reason any of this matters is Tara. The rumor mill matters because it harmed innocent people and delayed the truth about Tara. The trials matter because they were the attempt to find justice for Tara. The legal precision matters because getting it wrong would be an injustice both to Tara and to the living people the case involved. Every part of this story derives its meaning from the real woman at its center, and when we lose sight of her, we lose the reason the story matters at all. So we hold on to Tara, the person, and we insist that she, and not the drama around her, is the heart of it. That insistence is, in a way, the most important thing we can do in telling her story. We can keep Tara human. We can refuse to let her be swallowed by the case her name became. We can remember the teacher who shaped young lives, the mentor who gave her time, the woman who was loved by a community and a family. That is the truest justice we can offer her, deeper than any verdict, the justice of being remembered as a whole person, a real and valuable human being, and not merely as the center of a famous unsolved question. Tara Grinstead deserves that, and it is what we have tried tonight to give her. Remember Tara tonight not for the tangled legal aftermath, not for the rumors that consumed a town, but for the bright and generous life she lived, for the students she taught and the young women she mentored and the community she enriched. Remember, too, the innocent people harmed by the rumor mill, and let their suffering be a warning against the easy cruelty of suspicion without proof. And remember that behind all the complexity, a real woman was lost, a teacher and a sister and a friend, and that the full truth of what happened to her is still, in the deepest sense, owed. Tara Grinstead mattered, and she matters still, and she deserves to be remembered as the beloved teacher she was, and to have, one day, the complete truth her family and her town have sought for so long. Rest easy, Tara, and may the full answer so long awaited finally one day come to light.